Is that what you want? Okay. We're ready to roll anytime. Mr. Stone, if we could please, if we could start off with what was your first exposure to George's work? When were you first aware of George?
Well, I first became aware of him in the 20s. I ran a little paper in 1922 in my hometown when I was 14 years old, and I was very politically conscious then. And I was very much aware of the problems of Italian fascism, and I knew about his work for the Chicago Tribune as its Rome correspondent that grew into his wonderful book, Sawdust Caesar. It's a marvelous title, and it really disposed of Mussolini in one wonderful phrase, Sawdust Caesar. And I remember as a young reporter in Camden, New Jersey in 1926, covering a Rotary Club meeting. There was a visiting professor speaking. He'd been to Italy, and he was talking about the wonders of fascism and how it made the trains run on time. And I was so angry, I got up from the press table and denounced him. And when he finished, I said, why don't you tell the other side of the story about the murder of Matteotti and Amendola and the Squadristi, what they did to the labor movement? And he complained to the business manager. It didn't do him any good because the paper was anti-fascist. My boss, J. David Stern, was a good anti-fascist. So even though it wasn't conventional procedure for a reporter to denounce a speaker, it came out very well. And then I went up to New York in '33, and I remember when George started the In Fact. I forget what year was that. What year was that?
1940.
40? And I was a subscriber to it. And then I was over in Paris as correspondent for the successor paper, the Compass, for about 9 months in the winter of 1950-51. And George saw me over there and encouraged me to I thought the paper wouldn't last very long, come home and start a little weekly like his. And so I did after these newspapers closed down that I've been working for in New York. There's a whole series of papers, left of center, the PM, New York Star, and the New York Daily Compass. When the last one closed, the day, just before Election Day in 1952, and I couldn't get my old job back at The Nation. I'd been their Washington correspondent for quite a few years. I started the weekly in 1953. And like George's paper, it was 4 pages, and he was really the father of the alternative press, in the sense of a paper that was small enough so it could be run with independent financial means, without a lot of money and without the necessity for backers and all those things that inhibit one's freedom.
Just digress for just a moment. You worked for J. David Stern.
Yeah.
And George evidently wrote for him during the Spanish Civil War, when he was covering the Spanish Civil War. Didn't Stern own the Post at that point?
Yes, he owned the Camden Courier Post, which I began working when I was 15. And then I worked for him on the Philadelphia Record when he bought the Record. And when he bought the New York Post in December 1932, he took me to New York with him as editorial writer. And I remember George's stuff from Spain. We were the only paper in New York that was friendly to the Spanish Republic, and the pressure was very great. And the attitude of the Catholic Church in those days was very different from what it is today. Cardinal Spellman was very pro-Franco. And the bishops weren't talking up then for freedom and republicanism the way they are now, to their honor. in El Salvador and Central America generally.
What effect did George's work have on your work as a journalist in those days and through the 30s and 40s, and then ultimately on I.F. Stone's Weekly?
Well, I don't know. We were all what Teddy Roosevelt stigmatized as muckrake journalists. A dreadful phrase he got out of Bunyan, I believe, and that he applied to that wonderful group of American journalists before the First World War who exposed the trusts and fought for labor unionism and are very socially conscious, and many of them were socialists, like William Dean Howells and Henry Demarest Lloyd of the Chicago Tribune. Is that turning off?
Yeah, just a second. A little technical problem, yeah. Did we glow?
Probably did.
Yeah, the off light. Suggested turning off the light in the
Next
room
room.
next door if that'll help.
That might cut down.
Well, won't hurt anything to turn it off. It's this here. We have to go on. Let's just go back.
You do it,
They
Pat?
could they cut down the light in the hall too if they want to.
Okay, we're all set.
Tap it, I think I gotta change it.
Okay.
Hen-
discussing the
Henry
effect-
Henry Demarest Lloyd of the Chicago Tribune, who was a wonderful writer. His book Wealth Against Commonwealth is unjustly forgotten. It's a brilliantly written book about the Standard Oil Trust and Upton Sinclair and the old Collier's magazine, and so that was the term that Roosevelt coined for them. Later he jumped on the bandwagon of progressivism. So George and I were both products, as was my old boss, J. David Stern, of that same period. That is, a newspaperman who felt an obligation to fight for the underprivileged and against injustice and against the arrogance of great wealth and concentrated economic power. The same trends that gave us the antitrust laws and Federal Trade Commission, many of the reforms of Woodrow Wilson and later of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it was both a socialist and a liberal tradition, because the Socialist Party was a very powerful force in America before the First World War. It was its main organ, the Appeal to Reason, had a 500,000 circulation, which was a lot in those days. So we were products of the same trend. I guess it goes back to Tom Paine and the American Revolution.
Were you ever a contributor to In Fact?
No, George didn't have very many contributors or any.
Well, yeah, I didn't know if you were ever one of the. I know that he ran certain
No.
stories that were too hot for people.
No,
to get into
I was an editorial writer on the New York Post, and I had a lot of freedom, and it was a good paper.
That's true. You weren't in the situation
And it
that
was
some of the Hearst writers were.
It wasn't tabloid, it was full size, so I had a lot of freedom. And then later I worked for Ralph Ingersoll, who was also a wonderful man to work for and a great editor, as was David Stern. It was a pleasure to work for them. So I wasn't on papers where a man would feel frustrated.
And the need to contribute to In Fact.
Yeah.
What effect do you see of George's work and then your subsequent work with the Weekly on what we see in the press today and some of the freedom that we see in the press today, and some of the changes that have come about since George's time?
Well, I think that the George's work, and to some extent, I guess, my work, helped to inspire a lot of the younger reporters to infuse a fresh spirit and some crusading zeal back into the daily papers. See, there were a lot of crusading papers before the First World War. William Randolph Hearst started as a progressive left-wing crusader. In fact, when he ran for governor of New York in 1906, he got red-baited on the ground that Arthur Brisbane, his columnist, was a socialist, because Brisbane's father, Albert, was a Fourierist. You know, the utopian socialist. And as you know, the United States, especially New England, was a stronghold of utopian socialism even before Marx. So, but one thing I think that the In Fact and the Weekly did was to show younger people that you could scrape up a few bucks, start a paper of your own, and thumb your nose at the establishment, and still make a living and do your job as a journalist. I think all the so-called alternative papers of the 60s really owe something to the example of George Seldes, and I do, and they do to both of us.
Do you,
Remember we talked about the speech in El Salvador? Just hold it.
yeah, actually, I was getting towards that anyway, but thank you for reminding. Do you think there's a need today for some of what happened with In Fact and with the Weekly? Is there still a need for papers that are willing to go out there on a limb?
Well, Tris Coffin here in Washington runs a weekly newsletter like mine and George's called The American Spectator. And he's from up in New England. He does a very good job. Very much the same way with he and his wife, and it's like George and his wife and my wife and I doing it out of their house. And there should be room for lots of different opinions. There are too few papers nowadays. It's so expensive to run a big daily. When I first went to New York in December '32, there were quite a few more papers than now, and even more earlier. Every city had 5, 6 daily papers. Philadelphia did, Chicago did. Now it's down to 1 or 2 in most cities, and a lot of places just 1. And I don't think that's good enough.
I agree. And the cities that do have more than one paper are often conglomerates where both papers are owned by the same people anyway.
And some of those conglomerates are pretty bloodless, and they really run like businesses. Others, like the Ritter chain, is pretty good. And there's still some good papers around, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times and the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal runs a lot of the kind of stories that George and I used to take up. The editorial page is very reactionary and quirky, but the news columns, the reporters really dig, and they come up with a lot of socially conscious stories. And they give a lot of, magnanimously give a lot of freedom to people left of center. On the op-ed page, they have Arthur Schlesinger and Harding Carter and Alexander Coburn. And, but the average small town, small city paper in this country is not very good because just from one simple point of view, I'm not complaining about their policies, they don't have enough news in them. If you're traveling around the country and you get away from a couple of big cities, you don't know what's going on. The local papers don't run very much. They get the AP or UPI file, but they don't use very much of it. So out in the country, there's room for alternative small papers. Of course, a lot of people buy the news weeklies, Time and Newsweek. But on the whole, they're pretty establishment and pretty conventional and rehash mostly what's in the daily papers. Although Newsweek has had a couple of real pieces of journalism, one on Latin America recently. Most of the stuff is very well written, but it doesn't add much to your knowledge if you read a couple of big city papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post every day.
Excuse me. Bob? Lead me on El Salvador.
Okay, I'm
I
sorry.
just blanked on that.
Sure. We saw a tape that, unfortunately, the tape was atrocious,
Can you hear, Bob? Yeah. Okay.
of your introduction to George at the Polk Awards. And you said that what you wanted to do was to take some of your time, and you thought that George would agree and spend that time talking about what's going on in El Salvador.
Oh yes, because I said if George were publishing his paper, that's what he'd be focusing on.
What was happening? I can't remember exactly when that was, so I don't know. Were you focusing on what was going on there, or the fact that no one else was talking about it?
Oh no, there was a lot of coverage in the papers. That's a good deal of coverage in the papers. But there was room for more.
What kinds of things would you have expected George to cover had he been dealing with, in fact, at the time?
Well, he'd cover the killing of those poor nuns and the American land reformers and the inability to get the El Salvador courts to act and the way the American government was playing up to these murderers while talking about human rights. I mean, we've always pursued an imperialistic policy in Latin America, supporting the great landowners against the peasants, the common people, and our power, American power, almost unbeknownst to most Americans who know very little about it, but our power in Latin America has really rested on a triad of the landowner, the general, and the priest. And the priests have defected to the honor of the church to the side of the peasant, and a lot of the generals are younger people out of the middle class who are nationalistic and reformist in some of the countries. So things have changed a lot there. From the days when General Smedley Butler of the Marines complained that he was tired of having to go down there and act as an errand boy and bill collector for Wall Street.
Well, we just lost our power again. Do you have anything else that you want to?
I don't think so. I think we're all set.
I think we lost our power at a fortuitous moment.
Well, maybe if you turn the light out in the hall, do you need that hall light?
No, I think we're
Yeah,
I think we're all set.
questions.
Yeah, I think we've covered basically what we wanted to cover with the interview.
The light is up.
All right. All
Although,
right.
here we go again.
Oh.
I'm not sure if there's anything to.
Why don't you let it run just a little bit? I'm
Sure.
just gonna go one more question. Are we running?
Yeah.
Yeah. Should I give it another five seconds or so?
That's fine.
Just as a wrap, and this is a general question, what kind of national stories, particularly with what's going on in the government today, if in fact, or if the weekly were running today, as a journalist even, living up in Vermont, I sometimes don't think that the national press is doing their job in their coverage of Washington. Do you think that the coverage would be any different from an alternative standpoint of what, in fact, in the weekly we're looking to accomplish?
Well, I think the Washington Post and the Times do a pretty good job of covering Washington. But there's always more to be learned. People don't read, a lot of the critics of the newspapers don't read the papers. If you don't read them, you don't know what's in them. And a lot of kids, I talk to kids at journalism schools, they don't read newspapers. I don't know how they expect to become a journalist. But I think that Reagan has really gotten away with murder with the supply side economics and the huge and insane military program, which has brought a lot of protests from inside the military services themselves. I gave a talk at the press club, my one talk in many, many years, because I was out of there for many, many years, and they asked me to come back. We had a kind of a reconciliation thing. This was last spring. See, last week, no, I guess it was spring before last. Spring before last, and I said that if Reagan would suspend his tax cuts for 3 years and suspend his increases in the military budget over the increases already made by Carter for 3 years, that he would have a $40 billion surplus by his own figures in 83, and a surplus of that size in the United States would lower the interest rate all over the world, stop the outflow of capital from Western Europe, revive business in Western Europe and in the world, and revive independent business here in America. That's not very radical. It's really a genuine conservatism instead of the kind of kooky economics that Reagan used to excuse a real ripoff for the super wealthy. I mean, in a time of inflation, there has to be austerity, and no society on the planet has been able to escape that. And that austerity means sacrifice. But to put all the sacrifices on the poor, the blacks, and the elderly, and hand out enormous tax benefits to the super rich just didn't make any sense, either from the standpoint of social equity or from the standpoint of sound conservative fiscal policy. But nobody paid attention to it. It was just treated as a cute event. You know, Izzy Stone back at the press club, a lot of cute stories. But what I had to say was what a lot of people are saying now. But too late to do it.
Just one more question. Gosh. Good Lord, I just slipped my tongue. We're talking about Reagan.
See, journalism is not a business. And it shouldn't be run as a business, as just a way of making money. It's a profession, and it's a calling, and it's a major part of a free society, and that's what Jefferson intended to be. And the value of these alternative papers is that despite the power of great wealth and despite the enormous cost of running a modern newspaper, it's still possible, if you have the nerve, to have a little paper and speak your mind and reach a part of the public and have an effect on the rest of the profession. And that's all of the good. And I think that Jefferson would have liked that development, would have approved of it. I think in this respect, George is very much in the best American tradition.
What did you think of the Polk Award coming so late in his life?
Well, the establishment never gets around to honoring a maverick until he's practically posthumous and they think it's safe to pat him on the head.
A friend of mine, the term I like is one a friend of mine has come up with for the attention that's suddenly been given George in his 91st and 92nd years, that he's one of the few men who have managed to live long enough to receive posthumous attention while he was still alive.
Posthumous what?
Posthumous attention while he was still alive.
That's about it.
Yeah.
That's about it.
I think I'm all set. Are you?
Okay.
Got a question?
I had a question. I lost it. But it wasn't time.
Okay.
You know, if we could, just one last thing. If we could ask you to maybe give us a one quick, maybe 10 or even 15, whatever, you know, a very short recap about what's your opinion of George's work, you know, instead of just specifics, just in general, an opinion of his work.
Well, it was independent. It was radical. It got down to the roots of things. It exposed big business malpractices that a lot of the big papers are afraid to touch. It was anti-fascist and upheld civil liberties. Those are all very valuable contributions.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Can we just stop for a second and play it back so we make sure we have it?
Sure.
All
Let me
right.
turn off this light over here.
Yeah.
I believe that's... Is this
Okay,
bothering
you've
your
got this.
cataract some?
No, it isn't. I must say that the cameraman handled this very well because it doesn't hurt my eyes.
There we go. They're just going to check it for a moment.
All right.
Be all set.